Hello and welcome to Module 1, Part 1, your pre-work video, Historical Perspectives of Early Childhood Care and Education. This project was made possible with funding from the Rhode Island Office of the Post-Secondary Commissioner's Early Child Care Education Career Pathways Project. By the end of this session, you will be able to identify key historical events that contributed to the development of the current early child care and education system. Early childhood care and education has a history of being managed through various agencies, including the Department of Education and the Department of Human Services. In many states, this continues today, with child care being overseen by DHS and preschool, pre-K being overseen by departments of education. Head Start is a program that is governed by the federal government. We're going to watch two videos shortly that will help us make connections regarding the significance of the history of this field to events in today's early childhood care and education system. Organized childcare didn't really exist in the United States until World War II. Up until this time, children of middle and upper class families might go to private nursery schools for a few hours a day. However, this changed during World War II when many women entered the workforce taking on wartime jobs. The Lanham Act gave the Federal Works Agency the authority to fund the construction of houses, schools, and other infrastructure for laborers in the growing defense industry, many of whom were women. It was not specifically meant to fund childcare, but in the late 1942, the government used it to fund temporary daycare centers for children of mothers working in wartime jobs. These next two videos are going to give us more insight into the history. And when you're done, a reminder to start to make some connections regarding the significance of the events of today's early childhood care system to what you've seen in the videos.
Since the dawn of time, working women have found creative solutions to the age-old problem of childcare. But the Industrial Revolution added a new urgency to this challenge, as American women flooded into New England's textile mills. The first infant schools began popping up, and they caught on like wildfire. That is, until a prominent psychologist claimed that early intellectual activity caused physical illness and insanity. Yep, insanity. The opinion of one quack doctor caused public support for early childhood education to vanish for decades. Poof. But at the turn of the century, as our country woke up to inequality on many fronts, progressive-era reformers took up the childcare cause too, making the education of poor children, our youngest, most vulnerable citizens, a top priority. Nurseries were once again in vogue, and kindergartens opened nationwide. Experts began codifying educational standards, and a new profession was quickly born, the preschool teacher. Then, in the 1940s, World War II sent 16 million men into the armed forces, and millions more women into the workforce. A child care crisis loomed once again. Sensational reports of children running wild in the streets caused a public outcry. So Congress, for the first time, established a nearly universal, federally subsidized childcare program, and it was a smashing success. For the kids and their working parents' financial stability, America had finally become a progressive society with universal high-quality early education for any family that needed it. Everything was looking up. So why isn't that how our system works today? Stay tuned for more from No Small Matter.
Now on to our second video, which continues the brief history of early learning in America.
Once upon a time, the United States offered nearly universal, high-quality childcare to any family that needed it. But as men came home from the war, women were pushed back into the home, and Congress abandoned our once revolutionary childcare system. Soon, a post-war baby boom took off, and demand for childcare began to far outweigh the supply, with only 4% of young children placed in a nursery school or daycare. At the same time, brain scientists debunked the popular notion that intelligence is genetic, finding that our brains are shaped by our early experiences, and that 50% of our cognitive skills are developed before the age of 4. So, what if early childhood education could not only help working families in need of childcare, but also help kids grow healthier brains? President Lyndon B. Johnson decided to test this theory out in his War on Poverty with an innovative new program called Head Start. In the summer of '65, over 500,000 3- and 4-year-olds entered 11,000 Head Start centers, specifically serving low-income families. It was so popular that Congress began drafting new legislation moving the U.S. full steam ahead towards universal high-quality childcare. So, what happened? Where is our universal childcare now? President Richard Nixon decided to veto the bill, comparing it to Soviet Russia's communal child-rearing programs, and arguing that childcare would weaken the American family. Today, a patchwork of Head Start, state, and city programs help to cover just a small fraction of families. And what you get varies drastically, depending on your zip code. Want to know more about how early learning is funded in your neck of the woods? Stay tuned for more from No Small Matter.
Now that you have a sense of the history of early care and education in the United States, what did you notice about how care and early education were viewed? Were they seen as the same thing or different? Certainly, we can see from these two videos that care was seen as custodial, where preschool or pre-K were seen as education and were most often for those with money or the very poor. In the next few slides, we will learn about the governance of childcare, preschool, pre-K, and Head Start. Kindergarten was one of the earliest types of early care and education to be introduced in the United States. This idea began in the early years of early child care education, when the first kindergarten was started in 1856 in Watertown, Wisconsin, by Marguerite Schurz. These kindergartens were based on Froebel's model, which emphasized a play-based approach to learning and socialization. A few years later, in 1860, Elizabeth Peabody established a kindergarten in Boston, Massachusetts. The next two videos focus on Froebel's kindergarten and How Did Kindergarten Come to America? A Short History of Education. Both of these videos provide a context for understanding the origins of kindergarten.
In 1838, the German educator Friedrich Froebel laid the foundations of modern education when he opened the Play and Activity Institute. Froebel soon called his institute a kindergarten, reflecting his belief that young children should be nurtured and nourished like plants in a garden. Froebel, who studied under the Swiss educator Johann Pestalozzi, established the idea that games and playing are typical and essential forms of life. Activities in the kindergarten included singing, dancing, gardening, and self-directed play. Quality time spent like this was a considerable improvement to the life of many children, given that the alternative was often to help parents with work. He also introduced the concept of freie Arbeit, which can be translated into free work. During set periods of time, children were allowed to work on things by themselves. Where many adults saw pointless play, Froebel saw important learning taking place. While practicing their concentration skills and resilience, the children also learned about engineering, logic, and physics. To help facilitate this process, he developed a set of educational toys known as Froebel Gifts. The set contained 20 objects, such as balls, blocks, and sticks. Froebel carefully designed the toys to help the children in his kindergarten recognize and appreciate common patterns and forms found in nature. His innovative ideas soon found appeal, and many young educators came to learn from Froebel and to see the immense potential displayed by children at his institute. Later, many of Froebel's students opened their own kindergarten, and Germany experienced a rapid growth in the numbers of early childhood centers. Then, something bad happened. After suppressing the German revolutions of 1848 to 49, the Prussian government started a crackdown on new democratic ideas, and women were forbidden from being politically active. The fact that some were operating a kindergarten all by themselves was seen as problematic. And so it didn't take long for the government to label Froebel's kindergarten ideas as dangerous to both the state and church. Soon, all schools that followed Froebel's principles were banned. For Froebel, who saw his life's work destroyed and the future of all the children disrupted, this was a terrible blow. He died in dismay just a year later. But the ban caused a diaspora of kindergarteners who could no longer work in Germany, spreading Froebel's ideas all over the world. One of Froebel's students founded the first kindergarten in the United States in 1856. But the story didn't end there. Exactly 20 years later, a young woman named Anna Lloyd-Jones stumbled upon a set of Froebel's gifts at a visit to the first World's Fair in the United States. Anna, a teacher by training, was so excited by the wooden toys that she bought a set for her 9-year-old son. Little Frank loved the toys his mother brought home and began building all kinds of geometrical structures, first with the wooden toys, later in miniatures and with other materials. Without formal training, Frank Lloyd Wright became one of the world's most renowned architects, responsible for some of the most iconic buildings in modern architecture, many of which resemble Froebel's toy blocks. Germany lifted its ban on kindergartens in 1860, realizing that it was a terrible mistake. And while Froebel wasn't around anymore to witness the rebirth of his ideas in his homeland, they continued to spread around the world and became an inspiration for Maria Montessori, Rudolf Steiner, and many others who set out to innovate formal education. Froebel once said that play is the highest expression of human development in childhood, for it alone is the free expression of what is in a child's soul. Frank Lloyd Wright described the influence of such play on his approach to design as follows. For several years, I sat at the little kindergarten tabletop and played with the cube, the sphere, and the triangle. These smooth wooden maple blocks, all are in my fingers to this day. How was your experience with play and learning when you were young? Did you go to kindergarten? And what are your thoughts on play as a medium for growth and development? Share your thoughts. To download this video without background music or to learn more about the topic, visit sproutschools.com.
Now that we've learned a little bit about the history of kindergarten in Germany, let's explore a video that shows us how it came to the United States.
How did the kindergarten get to the United States? German immigrants brought it over the Atlantic to the U.S., but it wasn't the old stodgy white dudes who had brought the common school movement to life that were behind the kindergarten movement. Instead, it was a network of middle and upper class white women who enthusiastically embraced new education generally and the kindergarten specifically as an antidote to the rigidity of the common school movement, as well as the issues of urbanization and immigration that were roiling the United States at the time. These women, who were limited by a Victorian notion of a private female sphere, were drawn to kindergartens in no small part because it gave them a public voice. As historian Ann Taylor Allen writes, women's opportunities for intellectual self-expression were very limited. Child-rearing was one of the few subjects on which they could speak with authority. Kindergarten theory gave women reformers an impressive philosophical and scientific vocabulary with which to comment not only on child-rearing, but on a host of related issues. One of the leading proselytizers of the kindergarten movement in the U.S. was Elizabeth Peabody of Boston, none other than Horace Mann's sister-in-law. She set up the first non-German kindergarten in Boston in 1860, and later traveled to Berlin to see the best in action. Her essay, Kindergarten Culture, was reprinted in the U.S. Commissioner of Education's annual report of 1870, and in it, Peabody warned that the country's prodigious energies are running so wild into gambling, trade, and politics, threatening us with evils yet unheard of in history. The nation's salvation might be found in Froebel's kindergarten. Quote, "Without taking the child out of his childish spontaneity and innocence, Froebel would make him a kind, intelligent, artistic, moral being, harmonizing the play of will, heart, and mind from the very beginning of life into a veritable image of the creativeness of God." Peabody got the word out, and soon women around the country found their vocation in kindergarten education. In contrast to the earlier infant schools, Peabody was explicit that these kindergartens should not merely be preparatory to the common school. She defined kindergartens, in fact, explicitly as schools for a company of children under 7 years old who did not learn to read, write, and cipher. So what did they do then? They directed children's spontaneous and natural activity towards a more certainly beautiful effect than it can attain when left to itself. The object learning of Pestalozzi remained a key feature, with manuals instructing would-be kindergarten entrepreneurs in how to introduce these objects, typically called gifts in the jargon of kindergarten theory, and use them to teach all manner of knowledge. Class was oriented around tables rather than rigidly organized in unmovable benches, all facing forward, as in the common schools. The kindergarten in practice in Boston of the 1870s was typically for the wealthy, with tuition between $60 and $100 per year, which, trust me, was a lot back then. But enthusiasts argued that even rich kids needed to learn what was natural, since they were growing up in this strange new world of the city. Kindergartens, in their view, followed nature's plan for development. The literal gardening that was a key feature was required not because the kids were going to become farmers, but because of the importance of learning from Mother Nature. G. Stanley Hall, who was one of the pioneers of the emerging field of psychology and human development, studied Boston's first graders in 1880, on the dime of kindergarten supporters, by the way, and he found that 80% of children couldn't identify a beehive, 87% were dumbfounded by a pine tree, and 92% didn't even know what a triangle was. Kindergartners, however, did better on his exams than did those without it. While Hall himself was critical of the restrictive nature of kindergartens in practice, his work defining childhood and the basics of development provided ammunition for the kindergarten reformers, who sought to soften the rigid common school pedagogy. And the kindness of the teaching, in contrast to the harsh discipline of the common school, would help acclimatize the young to the American experiment in democratic capitalism. As one prominent reformer explained, kindergarten would teach trust and responsibility. Children must trust parents. We must all trust the tradesmen with whom we deal. Both the government and the economic system depended on it. All this could be hard to institute in practice, and the quality of kindergartens varied considerably, though Peabody and her allies worked to stamp out false kindergartens. While some kindergarten promoters were content with tuition schools, a lot of the fervor for kindergartens in the U.S. came from those who wanted to intervene in what would later be called a cycle of poverty. They sought to instill in the rough-and-tumble immigrant boys and girls, growing up often with little supervision in increasingly industrial environments. As one magazine declared, kindergarten was our earliest opportunity to catch the little Russian, the little Italian, the little German, Pole, Syrian, and the rest, and begin to make good American citizens of them. A loose confederation of charity kindergartens sprung up, often funded through private philanthropy rather than tax dollars, and run by women's groups and settlement houses. A big feature of these charity kindergartens were frequent home visits by the teachers to observe the mother-child bond in action and nudge the parents to become better tutors for their young citizens. Kindergarten reformers made the case for a broader set of children's rights. In California, Kate Douglas Wiggin published a book by that name in 1894. It laid out the case for all children to the right to, quote, a place of his own, to things of his own, or surroundings which have some relation to his size, his desire, and his capabilities. In many respects, so far this story seems very similar to the common school movement, which made ubiquitous the public elementary school. We have a growing set of expensive private schools and a separate set of charity schools. Likewise, we have a set of reformers who were talking to each other, publishing in journals, petitioning state and city government to make these institutions universal. And yet it didn't happen in the case of the kindergarten. It wouldn't become universal until the 1980s, and by that point it had taken on a much more circumscribed definition as an additional grade for 5 to 6-year-olds in preparation for the first grade. Why were they so different? We'll pick that up by looking at the St. Louis experiment in universal public kindergarten.
As the war ended, childcare was slated to no longer be government funded, but with parental pressure, it did receive funding through 1946. National childcare lobbying gained momentum in the 1960s and 70s and was able to secure national funding through the Comprehensive Child Development Act of 1971, which established locally administered childcare centers. However, public sentiment shifted during the Cold War when anti-childcare activists emphasized that the Soviet Union funded childcare, and President Nixon vetoed a funding bill citing that it would commit the vast moral authority of the national government to the side of communal approaches to child rearing against the family-centered approach. We know that the U.S. did provide childcare as an entitlement in the past, but let's explore a little bit about why that hasn't continued today.
In war towns all over the United States, women are called upon to leave their homes and take jobs.
During World War II, nearly 1 in 3 American men went off to war, and women were expected to take their place at work.
They discover that factory work is usually no more difficult than housework.
Isn't this pretty hot for you?
Well, I hear it gets kind of hot around the kitchen stove, too.
But the problem was, who was going to watch Rosie the Riveter's kids?
When married women with small children have to take jobs, everything possible will be done to provide day care for the children.
For 50 cents a day, which would be about $8 now, mothers could leave their kids at a government-funded daycare center. Lunch was included. America actually set up universal childcare for working mothers. Canada and other countries did too. Around 500,000 American children attended these centers. But when the war ended,
Joy is unconfined.
so did the daycare. Families protested, calling for the centers to be permanent, but the federal funding stopped in 1946. And so the U.S. missed that start to begin a climb towards other childcare policies. Other countries didn't. Canada had the same protest, and some provinces decided to keep their centers open. That decision started them down a path where it was easy to implement other government-run policies. So, how did the U.S. end up here? Here are some of the richest countries in the world, and here's when each of them established a paid maternity leave policy, and a universal childcare policy, and let's throw in paid paternity leave for good measure. In France, they've actually had some form of universal childcare since the 1800s, but formalized the system in 1945. Sweden, considered to have one of the best systems in the world, they were the first to guarantee paid paternity leave, and they've provided full childcare for all children since 1985. You'll notice the US has none of these policies. Technically, there is a 12-week maternity leave policy, it's just not paid. That's up to your employer. And a few states offer preschool, and there are some childcare programs, but they're mostly for low-income families and far from universal.
Childcare in the US right now is very fragmented. There are different programs that function for different purposes and often work against each other.
Take a closer look at this chart. After World War II was a popular time for these childcare policies, but so was the 70s. The early 70s were a time for women's rights. Equal employment laws had just passed, divorce laws were loosened, and many countries established universal childcare policies. It almost happened in the US, too. Almost.
What happened in 1971 is there was obviously a sense that we needed to do something about childcare.
And Congress actually acted. Both the House and the Senate passed the Comprehensive Child Development Act.
This was a really extraordinary bill because it would have provided universal childcare. It would not have been stigmatized in the same way that welfare programs would have been. It would have been available to a much wider group of families.
But then, President Richard Nixon vetoed it.
No one expected the veto, a terrible shock. His veto message said that this is going to create communal childcare. It would Sovietize the American family.
That language was a response to criticism that he was going soft on communism, like by visiting China. But really,
the right wing began to see this as an encroachment because it could be used potentially by white middle-class families in order to support women leaving the home and going out into the workforce. They're not supposed to be working. We do want to make, poor Black and brown Indigenous mothers, like those are the non-deserving kinds of mothers that shouldn't be on welfare, they should be working.
Conservative Phyllis Schlafly led that opposition.
Women whose husbands have left them or divorced them or whatever have a very hard time. But when you look at these wives who simply want a standard of living higher than their husband is producing, crying around that they want somebody else to pay for their daycare.
They were organizing against childcare because it would take mothers out of the home. Just as the European countries were starting their childcare systems, we were shutting the door.
The day after Nixon vetoes the CDA, he signs into law a bill that created childcare tax deductions for middle-class and affluent families. It creates a two-tiered system. On one hand, you have these tax supports, and then on the other hand, you get these much more stigmatized direct supports for only low-income families.
Meanwhile, these countries were able to follow a path from one universal policy to another. Experts call this path dependency. So for these countries, once they established one universal policy, creating others was fairly straightforward. Where in the US, it's been easier to design policies within the parameters of the existing income-based programs or the tax breaks that Nixon founded.
He set a path where any kind of federal childcare policy would be as underfunded, stigmatized as possible. It's a system that reinforces and deepens inequalities of race, gender, and class. It doesn't end up helping so many of our families.
But just because we're on that path doesn't mean we can't change. Just look at the United Kingdom.
From a bird's eye view, these countries are following very similar paths.
Neither continued the daycare centers after World War II. Both had attempted childcare policies in the 70s. The UK's failed attempt was actually led by conservative Margaret Thatcher. But in the 90s, the UK actually shifted and established a universal pre-K program. So what changed?
It's framed as education, not welfare. And so those questions of deservingness aren't applicable in the same way because it's education for all children. It's part-time, it's not as generous, but I think that it is an example of how you can readjust your priorities and change direction.
The US had universal childcare once, and almost did again. But with policy, it's never really game over.
To this day, childcare is not considered an entitlement in the United States for all families. It's overseen by the Office of Child Care, known as the OCC. The OCC is under the Department of Health and Human Services and replaced the Child Care Bureau in 2010. The OCC administers the Child Care and Development Fund program, which originally began as the Child Care and Development Block Grant 30 years ago. This block grant was intended to help low-income working families pay for childcare and to improve the quality of childcare for all children. For more insight into this information, review the Office of Childcare document located in your syllabus to gain insight about the governance of early childhood care and education. You can specifically look at pages 4 through 6, which will provide definitions, information on governance structure, and highlight some of those issues of fragmentation that have been pointed out in the videos. Go to page 10 to look at the 2020 Education Commission of the States report so that you can actually see how Rhode Island measures up with its governance structure in our state. In addition to childcare, preschool and pre-kindergartners provide educational programs for young children. These programs often provided oversight through the Department of Education at both the federal and state levels. Finally, Head Start, which was started in 1965 as an initiative by the federal government to combat poverty, also provides care and education services to children birth through age 5. The Department of Human Services, through the Office of Head Start, provides oversight to these programs. In the United States, the federal role in education is limited. Because of the 10th Amendment, most education policy is decided at the state levels and local levels. Review the U.S. Department of Education website to understand more about how preschool is addressed in the Every Student Success Act. One exception to the federal oversight for education is the Head Start program. Head Start is governed by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and is authorized by law to provide services to low-income children and families to promote school readiness by enhancing their cognitive, social, and emotional development. Early childhood, or pre-K to 3, became a separate certification from elementary education in the early 1980s, when many states created the Early Care and Education Teacher Licensure Program. From what we have learned so far, we can see how fragmented the system of early care and education in the U.S. is. What does this mean to you as a leader or administrator in the field of early care and education? How does it impact your job? Throughout the course, we're going to address these issues in depth as we look at both business and human resource approaches to leadership in early care and education. As we prepare to move into the next video, continue to reflect on how this information informs your understanding of the history of early child care and education, and whether or not accessing this information helps to build a sense of why the past of this field is important to understanding the current landscape of early care and education and potentially opportunities to continue to transform this field. Thank you.